Take a pit stop for all things NASCAR with the Four Tire Change podcast. Here is your host, Dawson Iserloh.
Welcome back into the Four Tire Change podcast. Dawson Iserloh here with you. The Daytona 500, it finally happened. We're here to recap it, get you set up for Atlanta as well. I'm solo this week. Just wanted to give all my thoughts on the race because I thought it was really entertaining and a great, way to kick off the NASCAR season there with the 500. Of course, it ended up happening on Monday. That's not how we drew it up. We'd have loved this thing to happen in its regularly scheduled time slot on Sunday. But unfortunately, Mother Nature did not cooperate, and so we got a delayed Daytona 500. But it took center stage, and I thought still put up some fantastic racing. So let's kind of go through some of this here first before we get into some of the implications of it. There's a wreck on lap 6, and it's a really tough break for Harrison Burton. And, I went into this season saying that I thought Burton had to have a massive season. I think his job's on the line. I don't know if the Wood brothers would be willing to bring him back if he doesn't have another, or, not another, but a really big bounce back year based on what he did a year ago. And the super speedways provide him an opportunity to do that because he's going to have a chance to be competitive. And he gets taken out really without anything of his own doing here, just 6 laps into the race. It looked like Keselowski was at fault. He was getting really aggressive, and I don't know why anybody would be that aggressive that early in the race. I don't want to put the blame fully on Keselowski there because there might have been some intricacies to the situation. But the bottom line is Harrison Burton ends up with a really bad break, and his day ends very early on. And I was wondering if that was going to be kind of a precursor of things to come, but I think it actually had the inverse effect. I think everyone saw that wreck early on in the race, and everybody gets kind of spooked. And I think we really settle into some laxed, nobody trying to make any big moves after this. Now, it didn't mean there wasn't good racing because, again, I thought really for the most part you saw a lot of good stuff. But I thought everyone kind of was a little bit more hesitant to be aggressive after seeing what happened to Burton there early on. Another thing that became a storyline pretty immediately is the fuel mileage. And, a lot of drivers had some comments afterwards that they're not a fan of the way this was done. Essentially, everybody started saving fuel right away. And after that caution, there was this idea, hey, if we basically slow everybody down, we save fuel, we can maybe make it all the way to the end of the stage. Then you had a couple of drivers who didn't pit, who were like, wait, what are we waiting on? Let's drive away from the field a little bit. And so I thought it was an interesting chess match there of different strategies that were being implemented. And I really enjoyed that. Like for me, this was, and I'll get to my overall thoughts on this race, but I thought it was one of the better super speedway races we've had in a while because it really checked all the boxes for me. Did it have big moves? Did it have guys going for it? Yes, it did. Were the ends of the stages really compelling? They were. And then were there different strategies at different points in the race? Did we get to see some green flag stops? Did we get to see some differing opinions on how to run this race? And I thought we saw all that. Now, the box it didn't check off was an exciting finish. We'll get to that in a bit. Unfortunately, it couldn't check that box, but everything else for me, it had. So, I talked about the fuel mileage. It ends up that everyone has to pit, and the groups who come together kind of decide this running order. And I love that, that aspect of the strategy as well. When you have groups rejoining themselves based on the draft, right? Who's going to come out? Who has the momentum? Can a group get up and block? Is anyone bold enough to do that? Or does the kind of freight train overtake your group that pitted? Maybe it's 4 or 5 cars, maybe it's 7 or 8 cars. We got to see all that play out in the first stage. So for me, that was a really interesting stage and, really overall pretty compelling stuff. Stage 1 and 2, again, there's mostly tame racing. I don't think anybody was super aggressive, but everybody wanted to make it to the end, kind of be around at the end of this race. And I think you saw a lot of that. So at the end of stage 2, you get a little bit more of that racing, whereas there wasn't as much fuel mileage going on. You saw a little bit more just racing to the finish. And ultimately, look, Chase Elliott wins stage 1. I thought that was big for him to get off to a hot start this season. And I've talked about kind of what I think needs to happen for Chase. And then at the end of stage 2, when you get Kyle Busch getting a stage win as well, I think it really started to go, wait a minute, can Kyle get this done? Because we know that's been, kind of the issue for him. I talked about him being one of the best drivers who hasn't won the 500. And he had an opportunity there mixed in and was really running towards the front. And then, of course, we get the end of this race. So the thing I have written in my notes for the end of the race is aggression, but saves. Like, no one was overstepping too far. There were a lot of drivers that were making aggressive moves, but guys were keeping control of it. And I don't even know how they were doing that because they were really pushing the edges, but it was really well done. Eventually, of course, we do finally get the big one. Again, if you wanted to put some blame on somebody, I thought Bowman was the most responsible for it, and he gets through this. The instigators got through all of it. That's kind of the interesting thing. Look, sometimes NASCAR karma doesn't pay out fairly, right? And Bowman gets through the mess. You see half the field taken out there, including some real big-time contenders, some big names, as well as some guys who were hoping to have a good run. That takes a whole different approach, and then we have the end of this race. And so look, the end of the race, it was not ideal. You end up having a wreck, and right before they're able to throw the caution, they get to the white flag. So in essence, the race is over. They can't do overtime. I would have loved to see an overtime finish, but I understand why NASCAR made the call. I don't really have any gripe with their decision. And William Byron ends up getting the win. Look, I guess it's a little bit more fair that Byron wins this over Bowman, and it was like millimeters. I mean, it was close. Because Byron wasn't the full instigator, I didn't think, of the previous incident. But it is a little bit anticlimactic. Of course, we wanted to see that big Daytona 500 finish, and we didn't get to see it. But this is the emergence and another step in the direction of being an elite driver for William Byron. 6 wins last year, makes it to the championship 4. We saw him kind of really take advantage of all his talents. This time around, this season, you're looking, can he follow up on that? Can he do it again? Hendrick had a little bit of a weird year last year, but Byron and Larson were there at the end for him. And he starts this out by, now helping Hendrick tie the record for the most Daytona 500 wins by a team with 9. And he puts himself on a path to just keep going up. And I think he is one of the elite drivers in the sport at this point. He has fully gotten out of the shadow of, replacing Jeff Gordon and or Chase Elliott, of course, who had that kind of 2-year holdover in the 24 car before they gave it over to Byron. I think it's big for him. And that checks off a crown jewel. And, this could be a massive season for William Byron. Obviously, again, this doesn't mean he's going to have speed at every track. We know Daytona can be a one-off in a lot of these things, but it's a great start. And he's, by the way, one of the great super speedway racers. He hadn't previously had any success at Daytona, which is interesting, but he's had a lot of success at the super speedways, and you saw that again on display on Sunday. So there you go with the 500. The last thing I'll point out, I thought it was a really tough break for Michael McDowell. You may know by this point I have a soft spot for him. I'm a big fan of his. And he looked fast early on. Of course, he qualified on the front row motorsports. Everybody was excited about that, right? And then he's got engine trouble and just a lot of different issues. He's running off the pace. He ends up, I think, somewhere 16, 17 laps down, finishing in the low 30s here. And that's a tough break because, again, with some of those teams that don't necessarily have the most funding or maybe aren't the power teams, they have to take advantage of the super speedway racetracks because they can have speed there and they can compete there. And to not maximize for a guy like McDowell, that's really tough. So right along with Harrison Burton, now you're digging yourself out of a hole. And I think that's an interesting transition into this Sunday's race where they're going to Atlanta because it's another super speedway style racetrack. Now, of course, we know Atlanta, after the repave and the reconfiguration, it has given us that drafting style Daytona Talladega type feel. There's always been speculation that as that racetrack wears down, we're going to get further and further away from that. That's not how it was last year, though. It was still pretty much high draft racing, and still some of those cars that are more typically towards the middle to the back of the field had a chance. I expect us to see that again this week. We'll see if that changes, but I think we're going to see it again. And so now you have a really unique situation where a lot of the drivers and teams who had their cars set up for Daytona last week maybe don't have to make as many adjustments as we usually would be making, right? They have a notebook to go right from Daytona to Atlanta on. And if you had a really good run last week, you got a chance to parlay that into a really nice start through 2 races. Obviously, the other end of that is the guys like McDowell, Harrison Burton, some of those cars who finished down at the bottom of the field that aren't, again, your power teams. They're going to really be pressing here. They've got to get a good result at Atlanta. They can't have 2 bad results in a row, knowing that they're then going to be going to some of the other tracks that they're more likely to struggle at. If you're a big-time race team, look, if you're the Chase Elliott's of the world and you have a bad run here, you're feeling okay because you're going to have speed elsewhere, right? But for those guys who, know they're going to have to piece together finishes and try and get the best out of their cars, this is a big one. Corey LaJoie's another one to throw on that list. He ended up getting a good finish out of the 500. Can he parlay that into another nice run at Atlanta? Overall, my drivers to watch when it comes to Atlanta going to be much of the same guys. Look, William Byron's proven he can be there. We know Denny Hamlin's always a factor at these types of tracks. I think Corey LaJoie shows you he has a great ability for it. If McDowell has a car that doesn't fail him this week, I think he'll be right back there at the top as well. But I'm also looking at Chase Elliott. Look, Elliott hasn't had the most decorated history at these types of racetracks. But I liked the 500 that he ran. I liked how he kind of stayed out of some trouble here and there. And again, I picked him to have a huge year. So I think it has to start at some point. Why not this week? I think Elliott's in the mix, potentially putting himself in victory lane here at Atlanta, which would be exciting. Good news, the weather forecast is clear for once. NASCAR is going to avoid the plague that they always bring, which is rain to the racetrack. Looks like we're going to be all good. Could be a comfortable temperature and 70 degrees and sunny. That would be awesome for an Atlanta race here. Avoid all the stuff we had go on with Daytona and everything like that. I did want to throw in about Daytona as well. The Rock, what a great ambassador for the sport he was, sticking around till Monday, still giving the command, getting everybody involved. I thought that was awesome. I'm really excited that he was able to do that, because that's the type of voice that can resonate with people and get a fan that goes, man, look, I'm not all that into NASCAR, but The Rock's doing that, man. It looks like he really enjoyed it. Maybe that's something I'm interested in. So I hope that that's the result of names like that happening. We saw DJ Khaled was there. Of course, he couldn't stick around until Monday because he had other plans. Guys like that are busy, of course. But he was at the media day, did some interviews, did some fun things with the fans, and he seems like he's a fan as well. So all that, I think, is good. And Pitbull dropped the album with the Trackhouse name, and, of course, he's very supportive. Obviously, he's an owner of the sport, so that makes a little bit more sense there. And everything that Michael Jordan's done, I think there's a lot of good buzz around what NASCAR's doing. It's unfortunate that the weekend wasn't perfect and that they had to dance around, scheduling changes and things like that, but also still a great crowd as well at the 500. People stuck around for Monday. They did a nice job letting people in who had Xfinity Series tickets or 500 tickets into the Xfinity race, back and forth, and all went well, I think. You had a lot of turnout. Obviously, not everybody could go, but I think, given the circumstances, it was a pretty good turnout. So, exciting first week in NASCAR action. I'm really pumped about it. Really cool to see, after this week with Atlanta, the standings are going to be really interesting. You might have some guys way up there that you're not used to seeing, again, because we've got two basically super speedway-style races right off the bat. And then when we go to, places like Las Vegas and Phoenix afterwards, we'll see kind of how, those teams that we traditionally expect to have speed each and every week, we'll see if they can kind of get back up towards the top or if they're already at the top. Who knows? Should be fun. Thanks for joining us as always. Please go ahead and like, comment, subscribe. We'll have plenty more four-tire change action all year long. Plenty more guests will be joining me as well. But until then, signing out.